At just 15, Emily Harrington lives under the crushing weight of failure. While her father builds empires in Manhattan, headlines mock her red-marked exams and classmates whisper that billions can't buy brains. But everything changes when Zuri, the 9-year-old daughter of the Maid, quietly steps in with a simple idea that no tutor ever tried. What begins as a secret friendship turns into a map that rewrites Emily's destiny and forces even her powerful father to admit the truth before the world. Stay with us until the end to see how two unlikely friends prove that resilience and hope can outshine shame and fortune alike. Emily Harrington had grown up inside a fortress of comfort, but comfort meant nothing when her test papers came back painted in red. At 15, her days were no longer measured by school bells or the rhythm of classes, but by the sting of teachers' marks slashing across her answers, circling her mistakes with merciless clarity. Every grade sheet seemed like an indictment, every letter a reminder that she was not what her last name promised she would be. Classmates whispered when she walked past, the kind of whispers meant to sting, to wound. It wasn't just failing anymore. It was spectacle. In cafeterias, she caught fragments of conversations. How can someone with private tutors fail basic math? Or, guess all that money doesn't help upstairs. Each word pressed into her like invisible knives, reminding her that wealth bought her everything but peace of mind. The cruelty didn't stay within the walls of the school. One morning, as she stepped through the gates with her head bowed and her backpack slung awkwardly on one shoulder, someone raised a phone. A video of her hair falling in front of her face, walking quickly as if she could outrun shame, spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, it was plastered across social media, strangers who had never seen her in person laughing at captions. "Billions can't buy brains." Emily scrolled once, then shut her phone, her stomach turning. The comments weren't about her work anymore. They were about her, her family, her value as a person. The internet had judged her guilty without trial, and she didn't know how to defend herself. Each evening, Emily tried to prepare for the next day, but studying felt like drowning. She stared at equations until the numbers danced on the page, mocking her. Words in essays slipped away as if her mind refused to hold them. Tutors had been brought in, experts with calm voices and long resumes, but their polished methods only made her feel smaller. They spoke to her as if she were a broken machine that needed fixing, each one more certain than the last that their strategy would finally make her perform. None of them understood that every time she sat at a desk, panic tightened her chest until she couldn't breathe. Each failed attempt stacked on top of the last, forming a mountain she could no longer climb. At school, the teachers weren't cruel, but pity could feel just as heavy. Her math teacher, sliding yet another paper toward her, gave a smile too sympathetic, too soft, as if saying without words, "You're not like the others, are you?" Emily hated that look more than outright anger. She wanted someone to believe she could rise above this, not someone who had already decided she would sink. Friends, or the people who used to be friends, stopped asking her to join group projects. She was no longer the girl people wanted on their team. She was the liability, the dead weight. Isolation became her constant companion, wrapping itself around her like a shadow that refused to leave. The Harrington name echoed in every hall, every conversation, every headline. Her father's empire stood like steel over Manhattan, unshaken by storms or markets. But Emily, his only daughter, was crumbling under the weight of expectations she could never meet. She overheard her own classmates joke that she would never run a company, that she couldn't even run a calculator. Even the idea of sitting down for another exam filled her with dread so thick it stole her breath. She began to wonder if she would ever be more than the punchline attached to her last name, more than wealth, more than failure, more than a fragile story the world delighted in tearing apart. When she returned home after the viral video, Damien Harrington was waiting, He didn't raise his voice, didn't scold in anger. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her with the sharp eyes of a man who measured everything in profit and loss. His words fell like steel on marble. One more failure, and there are consequences. There was no comfort, no warmth, only the cold precision of a man who understood numbers but not feelings. Emily wanted to argue, to cry, to explain that she wasn't lazy or careless, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could hear was the unshakable verdict echoing in her chest. One more failure, and she was finished. At school, humiliation seemed to multiply with each passing week. Emily walked into classrooms with her shoulders tense, already bracing for the outcome of every test or quiz. Teachers lowered their voices when they discussed her work, yet the whispers never truly remained private. She heard the edges of their sentences, such wasted potential, or if only she applied herself. To Emily, those fragments were louder than lectures. They told her she was not only failing, but failing in a way that embarrassed adults too, as though her shortcomings were staining the reputation of the school itself. Every time her name appeared at the bottom of the grade sheet pinned to the wall, she felt another piece of herself slip further away. She tried to act as if she didn't notice, but she could feel the pitying glances, the subtle sighs when her hand went up in hesitation instead of confidence. Her classmates made no effort to hide their reactions. When she stumbled through a math explanation at the board, a boy at the back covered his mouth in exaggerated disbelief, and the ripple of muffled laughter stung more than outright mockery. A girl sitting near her leaned to her friend and whispered, "Can you believe she's a Harrington, with all that money?" The other snorted, replying just loud enough for Emily to hear, "Guess money doesn't buy brains." Each smirk, each sideways glance, pressed the truth deeper into her chest. She wasn't just failing, she was entertainment. Emily returned to her seat, cheeks burning, pretending to adjust her papers while her heart beat too loudly in her ears. The Harrington name was supposed to be armor. Instead, it had become a target. Even the papers themselves seemed heavier now. Each sheet returned to her hands felt like a weight pressing her down, especially when she saw the marks slashed across them in red. She held them with care, folding them gently as if trying to hide their shame. But the numbers at the top screamed the truth no matter how she tucked them away. It was not just one subject but many. Math, literature, science. Each corner of her education seemed to betray her, as though she were walking across a collapsing bridge with no safe step to stand on. Her attempts to improve became desperate scribbles in notebooks, staying up late under her lamp, whispering formulas to herself as though repetition could replace understanding. Yet, when the exams returned, nothing had changed. The world still saw her as the girl who could not measure up. The fortune her family had built stood in sharp contrast to her failures. The Harrington empire had risen over decades, funding skyscrapers, hospitals, universities. Her father's name was printed on steel and stone across Manhattan. Yet here she was, the only daughter, unable to add two equations without her pulse racing out of control. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. Imagine being rich enough to buy half the city but not smart enough to pass algebra, a classmate muttered once as Emily walked by. She lowered her eyes and said nothing, but the words carved into her like a blade. In her mind, she asked herself 1,000 times, how could towers rise under her family's name while she crumbled beneath the smallest tasks? In the middle of all of this, unnoticed by nearly everyone, there was Zuri. Small and quiet, she followed her mother through the endless corridors of privilege, carrying books or humming softly under her breath. Most people overlooked her, as if she were part of the furniture of wealth that surrounded the Harrington estate. But Zuri's eyes missed nothing. She saw how Emily's shoulders hunched before each test was returned, how she gripped her pencil so tightly her knuckles turned white, how her steps quickened when laughter erupted behind her. She didn't speak about it, not yet, but she carried each observation as if she were gathering clues to a mystery no one else cared to solve. To Zuri, Emily's struggles weren't entertainment. They were signals, patterns that deserved to be understood. Every glance carried judgment, every paper seemed heavier, and every whisper dug deeper than the last. The Harrington fortune had built towers in Manhattan, strong enough to touch the clouds, but Emily knew that none of those towers could shield her from the sting of whispered failure. And in the background, almost invisible, the sound of smaller feet echoed. Zuri walked silently behind her mother's cart, curious, observant, her young eyes capturing the cracks others ignored. While the world judged Emily, Zuri simply noticed. Zuri had a way of noticing things most people dismissed, where the tutors saw only a spoiled heiress who wasn't trying hard enough. She saw signals no one else seemed willing to read. Sitting quietly while her mother polished the Harrington floors, Zuri's eyes followed Emily. She saw the way Emily's breath hitched when the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, the way her shoulders tightened like strings pulled too taut. Every time a new tutor handed Emily a worksheet, her face drained as though the paper itself was a threat. Zuri didn't call it laziness. To her, it looked like fear. And unlike the adults who scolded or sighed, she carried that observation quietly, storing it like a secret only she could see. It wasn't just the classroom panic that caught her attention. Zuri noticed the odd ways Emily fought for control when everything else felt impossible. She lined her pencils from darkest to lightest, arranging them again and again as if the order could bring calm to the storm inside. She smoothed the corners of her notebooks, pressing them flat with care, even when she never wrote on the page. These weren't meaningless quirks. They were survival tricks, small rituals that made the world less chaotic. Zuri watched, understanding in a way even Emily didn't. She knew what it was like to hold on to little things when the big things felt too heavy. Sometimes Zuri lingered near the balcony door when Emily slipped outside, just to watch how her expression softened. The cold air touched her face, and for a moment, her fists unclenched, her breathing steadied. Tutors always told Emily to focus harder, to push through, but Zuri realized that forcing didn't help, it only trapped her further. What helped was the simplest thing of all, a little air, a little space, a reminder that she wasn't suffocating. Zuri held on to that truth silently, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that might one day fit. That evening, when Emily sat hunched over her desk with a pile of exercises spread out like weapons, Zuri passed by the doorway and stopped. She saw Emily pressing her palms against her eyes, whispering under her breath, as though begging the numbers to make sense. A single tear rolled down Emily's cheek, falling onto the paper where it blurred the ink. She quickly wiped it away, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone had noticed. Zuri hesitated, clutching the hem of her sweater, wondering if she should step in. She wasn't supposed to interrupt, not in this house where silence was her safest shield, but watching Emily collapse into herself was different. Something in her chest told her she couldn't just keep walking. Taking a small breath, Zuri walked into the room. Emily jerked up, startled, eyes red from holding back tears. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp but fragile. Zuri didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small square of paper she had folded carefully. On it was a hand-drawn sketch, strange, simple and childlike, but purposeful. She placed it gently on the desk, just far enough from the damp patch where Emily's tears had landed. The act wasn't grand, but it was bold for a girl who usually stayed invisible. Emily blinked at the card, then at Zuri. Her brows furrowed as she leaned closer, as though trying to understand whether this was mockery or kindness. The silence stretched between them, heavy with uncertainty. For the first time that day, Emily wasn't staring at equations or red marks. She was staring at the small, deliberate gift from someone who had been watching all along. She looked up, startled, unsure of what this quiet, unusual gesture meant, or what it might change. Emily picked up the small card cautiously, as if it were a foreign object. The drawing was simple, almost childish. 2 trains sketched in pencil, one puffing smoke as it left a station marked with a tiny square, the other following from another track. At the top, an arching bridge where the two met. Beneath it, 4 words were written in block letters: name, stage, act, lock. Emily blinked, confusion pressing at her temples. She turned the card over, then back again, as though expecting to find more explanation. Finally, her lips twisted into a bitter smile. "What is this?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "A joke?" Zuri didn't flinch. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her expression calm, firm in a way that seemed too old for her 9 years. "Not a joke," she said. "A map." Emily raised her brows, scoffing lightly. "A map to what? To failing slower?" Her laugh was brittle, more self-defense than humor, but Zuri stood her ground. "Every problem's a story," she answered. "You just have to tell it right. Name it, stage it, act it, lock it." She repeated the words with a rhythm, like beats in a song, her voice steady. There was no hesitation, no trace of doubt. Emily shook her head, holding back a sharp retort. She wanted to dismiss it, this strange little ritual from the maid's daughter, as another reminder of how hopeless things had become. Yet Zuri's eyes didn't waver. They weren't mocking, weren't pitying. They were expectant, almost daring. For a moment, Emily realized that the younger girl was the first person in weeks who hadn't looked at her like she was broken. The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken. Finally, Emily exhaled sharply and muttered, "Fine. Let's see what this magic map of yours can do." Zuri slid one of Emily's math problems toward her. Emily glanced at the page, her stomach tightening with the familiar wave of panic. Numbers crowded her vision, threatening to blur into meaningless symbols. She closed her eyes briefly, preparing to feel that same heavy failure. But then Zuri's voice echoed in her memory: name, stage, act, lock. Hesitantly, she whispered the first word under her breath. Name. She read the problem slowly, identifying what it was asking. Stage. She organized the pieces in front of her, writing them down step by step. Act. Now she began to work through the equation. Her pencil moved shakily at first, but with growing certainty. Lock! She checked her answer, sealing it as though clicking the final latch on a box. Emily stared at the paper, blinking in disbelief. The answer worked. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the solution wasn't a tangled mess, but a clean, logical path from start to finish. Her chest tightened, not with panic this time, but with something closer to relief. She glanced at Zuri, searching her face for a trick, but the girl only nodded. "See?" Zuri said quietly. "It's just a story. You can tell it." Emily wanted to argue, wanted to insist it was a fluke, but deep down, she felt the faintest shift inside her, like a door opening a crack. She looked back at the card, then at the answer she had just written. Her heart thudded strangely in her chest. The panic hadn't disappeared entirely, but for once, it hadn't drowned her. The 4 steps had given her something to hold on to, something steady in the chaos. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper as she repeated the rhythm again. Name, stage, act, lock. The words settled into her, anchoring her in a way she hadn't expected. To her shock, the answer held. For the first time, the chaos slowed down. The meetings started almost by accident. One evening, after the latest tutor had packed up their notes and left with polite but exasperated farewells, Emily sat slumped at her desk, already dreading the pile of problems waiting for her. Zuri slipped quietly into the room, clutching the folded card with the 4 steps. Emily raised an eyebrow but didn't send her away. They worked through a problem together, and for the first time in weeks, Emily went to bed without that familiar knot of despair tightening in her stomach. From then on, it became routine. After the parade of tutors, before the family dinner calls, when the mansion quieted down for the night, Zuri would appear with pencils and scraps of paper. They didn't announce it to anyone. These were stolen moments carved from the spaces where Emily was usually left alone to drown. Zuri's methods were unlike anything Emily had seen before. Algebra wasn't presented as cold numbers marching across a page, but as rhythms, almost like the beat of a song. Zuri tapped her pencil in a steady rhythm as Emily solved steps, reminding her to breathe, to take each movement as part of a sequence rather than a mountain to scale in one leap. Equations became tiny stories, two trains meeting, two rivers joining, two friends finding each other at a bridge. Fractions, once Emily's sworn enemy, became lighthouses standing steady in the dark, guiding her toward clarity. It was strange, almost childlike, but it worked. Emily found herself leaning into the metaphors, allowing the images to anchor her in a way raw numbers never had. At first, Emily resisted saying the steps out loud, embarrassed that she, a 15-year-old heiress, was whispering words like a mantra taught by a 9-year-old child. But the more she used them, the more natural they became. Name, stage, act, lock. The rhythm soothed her panic, grounded her wandering focus, and gave her a place to start when the numbers blurred. She began writing the words in the margins of her notes, circling them as though they were charms, protecting her against failure. Sometimes she muttered them under her breath during study sessions with tutors, who looked puzzled but said nothing. Only Zuri understood what the words meant, and that secrecy gave them a kind of sacred power. With each attempt, the fog that had suffocated her for so long began to lift. Emily found she could solve 2 problems in a row without spiraling. Then 3. The tiny victories built on each other, fragile but real. She no longer burst into tears every time she opened a textbook. Instead, she caught herself leaning forward, searching for the path through the problem rather than immediately recoiling from it. Zuri noticed the shift, her lips curving in a small, satisfied smile each time Emily's eyes lit with recognition instead of dread. These weren't miracles. They were progress, and progress felt like oxygen. The contrast between the official lessons and the secret ones was stark. Tutors came armed with diagrams, software, and sharp efficiency. Yet Emily only felt smaller after their sessions. With Zuri, there was no pressure, no sense that failure meant doom. If Emily made a mistake, Zuri simply leaned forward and asked softly, "Want to try again?" That patience wasn't professional, but it was human. It gave Emily room to breathe, room to try without fear. She realized she was learning not because she had to, but because for the first time she wanted to. The desire to prove the world wrong was still there, but layered beneath it was something gentler, the desire to prove to herself that she could. The 2 girls began to meet in stolen moments, after the tutors left, before dinner, late at night with pencils and scraps of paper. Zuri turned algebra into rhythms, equations into stories, fractions into lighthouses guiding the way. Emily tested each method, whispering the steps like a mantra. With each attempt, the fog cleared a little. Zuri's patience was not professional, but it was human, and that made all the difference. The morning of the exam arrived with the same weight it always carried for Emily, but this time there was something different beneath the fear. Her hands trembled as she clutched her pencil, her pulse thudding in her ears. But in the background of her panic was a quiet rhythm. Name, stage, act, lock. Zuri's voice, steady and calm, whispered from memory. She closed her eyes for one moment, whispering the words under her breath before opening the test booklet. The first problem stared back at her, and panic flared as usual, threatening to blur her vision. But instead of giving in, she forced herself to take the first step. Name. She named the problem. Just that simple action steadied her breath. She wrote out what it was asking, slowly, carefully. Stage. She listed the numbers, arranging them like the pieces Zuri had shown her. By the time she reached act, her hand no longer shook as much. The rhythm carried her forward. Around her, the classroom filled with the scratching of pens and the rustle of papers. Emily tried to block it all out, anchoring herself in the steps. Every time her chest tightened, she tapped her pencil softly against the desk, whispering the mantra in her head. The other students bent over their work confidently, some even finishing problems faster than she did, but for once, she didn't care about speed. All she cared about was moving through the questions one at a time, sealing each with the final word, lock. She checked her answers, not with fear, but with a strange sense of authority, as if she had earned the right to be certain. The hours dragged and flew at once, and when the bell rang, she sat back in her chair with a sigh that felt more like release than defeat. The walk to the bulletin board where results would be posted was torture. Emily's stomach churned as she joined the crowd of students gathering in the hall. Her old self wanted to run, to avoid the humiliation she had known so many times before. But Zuri's words pressed against her like a hand on her shoulder. You can tell the story. Every problem has a story. Emily stayed, gripping her bag strap tightly as the papers were pinned to the board. Whispers rippled immediately, a current of surprise spreading through the gathered students. She forced herself forward, eyes scanning the list. For one terrifying second, she thought she couldn't find her name. Then there it was, not at the bottom where she had always been, but near the top, 3rd place. Her breath caught. She blinked twice, almost doubting what she saw. 3rd. Not a failure, not barely passing. 3rd. Whispers grew louder behind her as classmates leaned over shoulders, pointing at her name in disbelief. Someone muttered, "No way," and another student gasped softly. Emily's chest swelled, not with pride exactly, but with the sudden realization that she had broken free from the prison everyone thought she belonged in. She turned, and for the first time, the looks aimed at her weren't smirks or pity. They were shock. Wide eyes, mouths slightly open, expressions that betrayed disbelief. The same classmates who had mocked her for months now stared as though she had performed a trick they couldn't comprehend. Emily's hands still trembled, but not from fear. This was different. This was power. She had done it. Not by buying answers, not by leaning on her last name, but by doing the work, by trusting the method, by refusing to collapse. She didn't smile yet, but her silence carried more weight than any grin. When the crowd began to disperse, the whispers didn't stop. They chased her down the hallways, echoing in corners and classrooms. She came 3rd. How? The disbelief was louder than the mockery had ever been. For the first time, Emily Harrington was no longer just the girl who failed. She was proof that she could rise. Hours later, when she returned home, the reality still felt unreal. She repeated it to herself in the quiet of her room. 3rd place. For the first time, the Harrington heiress had proved she could win without help. The glow of victory didn't last long. Emily's sudden leap from failure to 3rd place left more than a few people unsettled. Whispers of disbelief trailed her through the corridors, this time not mocking, but questioning. She must have cheated, someone muttered near the lockers. Another added, no way she got that score on her own. The murmurs reached the teachers, and soon suspicion weighed heavier than her pride. One afternoon, as her math class settled in, the teacher's gaze lingered on Emily longer than usual. His lips tightened before he finally spoke. "Emily Harrington, would you mind coming up here for a moment?" The words were calm, but the undertone made the entire room still. Emily froze in her seat, her throat tightening. She glanced around, noticing how every pair of eyes locked onto her. Some were eager, waiting to see her stumble, others quietly curious. The teacher continued, holding up the exam paper. "Your results were surprising. Too surprising, perhaps." Some students are wondering if this work was truly yours. Gasps rippled through the classroom. Emily's cheeks burned, her pulse hammering in her ears. "I didn't cheat," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Then prove it," the teacher replied, gesturing to the board. He handed her a marker, the challenge plain. "Solve it here. Solve it now." Her legs felt heavy as she walked to the front, each step echoing with the weight of accusation. The problem was already written on the board. Complex, intimidating, the kind that once would have sent her into spirals of panic. She gripped the marker so tightly her knuckles whitened. Behind her, the classroom was silent, filled with the breathless anticipation of her classmates. For a moment, Emily thought she might faint, but then she heard it. Zuri's voice, not in the room, but in her memory. Name, stage, act, lock. The mantra pulsed through her mind like a lifeline. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering the first word under her breath before turning to face the board. "Name," she said softly, louder than a whisper, but steady enough to carry across the room. She underlined the question with the marker, reading it aloud, forcing herself to acknowledge exactly what it was asking. Then she moved on. Stage. She wrote down the known values, carefully laying out the parts. Her voice grew clearer as she continued, "Act." The marker squeaked across the board as she worked, step by step, not rushing, not skipping, her hands moving with deliberate precision. Line by line, the solution unfolded, her confidence building with every stroke. She finished with the last word, lock. She circled the answer, then stepped back, her chest rising and falling in quick but steady breaths. The silence that followed was thick, heavier than any mockery she had ever endured. No one spoke. The class stared at the completed solution, flawless and clear. A boy in the back shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. The teacher walked forward slowly, studying her work with narrowed eyes. Emily kept her chin up, refusing to look away, even though her heart thundered. Finally, after what felt like forever, the teacher set the marker down and gave a curt nod. "Correct," he said simply. The single word broke the tension like glass shattering. A wave of whispers surged through the class, but they carried no laughter, only shock. Emily stepped away from the board, her legs shaky, but her head held high. For the first time, she felt the weight of proof on her side. No tricks, no money, just mastery. Damien Harrington sat in his office that evening, the latest school report laid neatly on the desk before him. Numbers, rankings, margins. These were the things he understood, the language of his world. But tonight, his eyes lingered not on stocks or projections, but on a line he had never expected to read. Emily Harrington, third in class. He traced the words with his eyes again and again, as if repetition would prove they weren't some clerical mistake. For months, he had endured the sting of headlines, mocking his daughter's failures. Now, for the first time, there was silence from the outside world, and it unsettled him more than their laughter ever had. He called Emily into the study, his tone clipped but controlled. "Explain," he said, tapping the report with his index finger. She shifted nervously, clutching a folder of her own notes. He expected to hear about the latest round of tutors, perhaps some strategy one of them had finally forced into her. Maybe it was sheer chance, a lucky exam. He waited with his brows raised, prepared for excuses. But Emily did not falter this time. Slowly, she spread Zuri's small cards across the polished wood, trains, bridges, lighthouses, steps written in block letters. The images looked childish against the sleek surface, but Emily's voice carried weight as she spoke. She explained each step carefully, the same way Zuri had shown her. Name, stage, act, lock, she recited, showing how every problem could be broken into a story, into something she could follow without drowning in panic. She pointed to the trains meeting on the bridge. "This helped me see equations as journeys," she said. Her father's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his gaze flicking between the drawings and her steady expression. "This one," Emily continued, lifting the lighthouse card, "kept me focused. Zuri told me every fraction is like a light guiding me, reminding me where I'm headed." Her words were clear, firm, and without hesitation. She wasn't repeating the polished jargon of tutors. She was speaking a truth that belonged to her. Damien leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He studied the cards with disbelief, the corners of his mouth tightening as though the very idea offended him. "These drawings," he said finally, his voice low, "are what made the difference." Emily met his eyes, unflinching. "Yes, they helped me. Zuri helped me." For a moment, silence filled the room. He thought of the checks he had signed for renowned educators, the endless hours spent bringing in specialists. None of them had broken through. Yet here was proof, undeniable, that it had taken none of them, but the maid's 9-year-old daughter. For a man who had built empires by believing that only expertise and money could guarantee results, the realization struck like a blow. He had been wrong. Utterly, completely wrong. His throat tightened, though he masked it well. He stared at his daughter, suddenly aware that he had never truly listened to her voice before tonight. She hadn't been lazy or incapable. She had simply needed someone to see her. Damien's fingers hovered over the cards, but he did not touch them, as though they burned with a truth he wasn't ready to claim. Emily's explanation ended, and the room remained heavy with unspoken words. Damien's silence was not the icy dismissal she was used to. It was something else, something closer to recognition. For the first time, Damien Harrington had no quick solution, no financial fix, no lecture to deliver. He had paid fortunes for expertise, but it was a 9-year-old girl who had broken through, and in that moment he was speechless. The grand ballroom of the Harrington Tower had been turned into a press hall, as it often was when Damien Harrington had something to declare. Reporters lined the seats, their pens and recorders ready, cameras aimed at the polished podium. But today, the atmosphere was heavier than usual, curiosity sharper. For weeks, whispers about Emily's sudden rise had filled tabloids and financial columns alike. She had gone from a failure mocked in headlines to ranking third in her class, and everyone wanted answers. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, convinced they would hear a carefully crafted narrative about tutors, elite academies, or some breakthrough investment in education. Instead, what unfolded left them stunned. Damien entered with his usual precision, suit pressed, jaw set, the image of control. Yet those close enough to notice saw the way his eyes flickered briefly toward Emily, who sat quietly to the side. He approached the podium, shuffled no notes, and leaned forward. "You want to know why my daughter's results changed?" he began, voice steady, but uncharacteristically stripped of its usual arrogance. Flashes lit the room as every word was captured. "The answer is not me, not the tutors I hired, not the money spent. The answer is a 9-year-old girl who saw what others didn't. Zuri Johnson, the daughter of a member of our household staff." The room stilled, pens pausing mid-air. Reporters exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. Emily, heart-pounding, watched her father continue. "I have always believed that solutions come from expertise and wealth," Damien said, his voice lowering, almost as though confessing. "But my daughter's path was changed by compassion, creativity, and patience. Things I cannot buy. Zuri took what my resources could not and turned it into something powerful, hope. And so today, I am announcing the Harrington Scholars Program." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Every staff member's child will have access to full scholarships, mentorship, and opportunities my daughter now has. Zuri will be the first." Gasps and murmurs broke across the hall, followed quickly by frantic note-taking and camera shutters clicking like hail. A reporter from the Times rose, voice skeptical. "Mr. Harrington, are you admitting that your daughter was saved from failure not by privilege, but by the daughter of your employee?" The question could have cut like a blade, but Damien did not flinch. "Yes," he answered simply, his eyes scanning the room. "And if you ask me, that makes the story not one of failure, but of possibility. If two girls from such different worlds can change each other's lives, why shouldn't we give that chance to more children?" It was not the soundbite anyone expected from the man known for ruthless boardroom decisions. The silence that followed carried more weight than any applause. Emily glanced at Zuri, who sat nervously near her mother at the edge of the crowd. The younger girl fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, eyes wide as if unsure whether she should disappear into the floor or stand tall. Emily reached out under the table, catching her hand, squeezing it with a smile that said everything words could not. For once, Zuri wasn't a shadow trailing through corridors. She was being named, acknowledged, honored before the world. The warmth of that recognition spread across her small face, and for the first time she lifted her chin high enough to meet the cameras head-on. By the time Damien stepped down from the podium, the story had already left the hall, carried by buzzing phones and breaking news alerts. No longer was Emily Harrington the billionaire's daughter who failed. She was now the girl who, with the help of her unlikely friend, had rewritten her fate. And what spread across headlines the next morning was not scandal or mockery, but a story of a friendship that had turned shame into promise. The announcement had landed, and with it, a new chapter for both Emily and Zuri had begun. Weeks had passed since the press conference, and the ripples it created were still spreading. But inside the Harrington estate, the biggest change wasn't the flood of congratulatory calls or the headlines that painted Damien Harrington as a surprising philanthropist. The real shift was quieter, more personal. Zuri now had a desk of her own. It wasn't elaborate or gilded, just a sturdy wooden table in the study Emily had once called her prison. Above it, pinned with careful hands, was a letter that seemed almost too precious to touch. The scholarship that bore Zuri's name. Emily leaned over her shoulder, the memory of their late-night lessons vivid in her mind. She whispered the familiar rhythm: name, stage, act, lock, V, and instead of tension or trembling hands, the words brought laughter. The two girls bent over their books side by side. Zuri, only 9, still had the wide eyes of a child discovering the world, but now those eyes shone with possibility. Emily, 15, felt years older than her age, worn by battles with fear and humiliation, yet now she carried something lighter in her chest. The lessons had not been about formulas or trains meeting on bridges. They had been about courage stitched together in small steps, patience whispered in the dark, and trust that grew where no one thought to look. Each time Emily recited the steps, she saw in Zuri's smile a reminder that maps aren't just for solving problems, they're for finding each other. The mansion, once suffocating with its silence and cold precision, had softened. Tutors no longer hovered, and for the first time, Emily's father had stepped back, not out of neglect, but out of recognition. Mealtimes were no longer tense interrogations about grades, but occasions where voices overlapped, sometimes even with laughter. Emily would glance across the table at Zuri and her mother, now seated not as shadows in the background, but as part of the conversation. It startled her at first, how quickly walls could shift, how easily new rooms could be built when someone dared to open the door. What once felt like a fortress designed to trap her now felt like a place that could hold her, not as an ornament of wealth, but as a daughter who mattered. Emily's grades did rise, and the newspapers that had mocked her soon changed their tone. But the girl in those photos was no longer defined by numbers on a page or red ink staining her tests. She was learning to stand in front of her class without trembling, to solve problems without doubting that her mind belonged in the room. Each small victory mattered, but what mattered most was the quiet knowledge that even if she faltered again, she wasn't alone. Zuri's presence had stitched resilience into her story, page by page, test by test. Where others had seen disgrace, the two of them had found a language of hope. On the afternoons they studied together, Emily would sometimes close her notebook and simply watch Zuri. She marveled at the way her friend tapped her pencil in rhythm, humming softly as though solving an equation was no different than singing a lullaby. Emily realized she had once measured worth in achievements and money, the same way her father had measured hers. But Zuri had given her something no test score could define: the gift of seeing herself differently. Not as a failure, not as a burden, but as someone capable of change. In that reflection, Emily saw her heart widen, piece by fragile piece. And so, in the quiet of the study, as the afternoon light stretched long across the room, Zuri and Emily leaned over the same sheet of paper. They laughed when Emily stumbled over her own four-step mantra, correcting each other like equals, not like teacher and student. The scholarship letter still fluttered on the wall, proof of what had already changed and what was yet to come. Emily no longer felt like the heiress who failed. She was the girl who found a friend, who discovered that resilience could be written not in red ink, but in steady lines shared between two unlikely hands. And there, in the map they now carried together, her heart opened wide enough to hold it all. We create each story with care and dedication, always thinking about you who are watching on the other side of the screen. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. It's your support that allows us to keep bringing more special stories like this one. Explore our other videos, leave your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this community alive together. Thank you for being with us. It means more than you can imagine.